The golden sunlight of Tuscany often masks the long shadows cast by the stone palazzos of Florence, where the Renaissance was not merely born from the brushstrokes of genius, but forged in the cold, calculating ledgers of a banking dynasty that redefined the nature of power. To understand the rise of the House of Medici is to look beyond the sublime beauty of the birth of Venus or the towering marble of David, and instead peer into the ink-stained parchment of the Medici Bank, an institution that transformed gold into political influence and piety into a weapon of statecraft. In the early 15th century, Florence was a city of fierce republican ideals and brutal factionalism, a place where the scent of lilies in the air was frequently replaced by the metallic tang of blood spilled in the Piazza della Signoria. Yet beneath this chaos, Giovanni di Medici laid the foundations of an empire built on the quiet accumulation of capital and the strategic manipulation of papal finances. He understood, perhaps better than any man of his era, that true authority does not always wear a crown or carry a sword, but rather resides in the ability to move the invisible threads of credit across borders, making kings and popes beholden to a family of mere merchant bankers. The ascent began in the cramped, bustling offices of the Via Larga, where the clinking of Florence provided the rhythmic pulse of a new age, as the Medici navigated the treacherous waters of the Great Schism by backing the right claimants to the Holy See, effectively becoming God's bankers, and securing a monopoly on the collection of papal tithes across Europe. This unprecedented influx of wealth allowed the family to transcend their humble origins, but it also invited a dark, corrosive envy from the established nobility of Florence, who viewed these upstarts with a mixture of fear and contempt, sensing that the old order of feudal loyalty was being eroded by a new world of liquid assets and intellectual patronage. As Giovanni passed the mantle to his son, Cosimo, later known as Pater Patriae, the stakes grew exponentially higher, for Cosimo realized that wealth alone was a fragile shield against the daggers of political rivals like the Albizzi family, who orchestrated his arrest and exile in 1433 in a desperate attempt to decapitate the rising Medici influence. His return from exile just a year later marked the true turning point in the family's history, a moment when the mask of the humble citizen began to slip, revealing a master puppeteer who used the bank's vast resources to buy the loyalty of the masses and the silence of the powerful, creating a shadow government where decisions were made in the private gardens of the Medici Palace rather than the public halls of the Republic. This was the era of the Velvet Coup, where the institutions of democracy were maintained in appearance while their substance was hollowed out by Medici gold, setting a precedent for a century of clandestine maneuvering that would see the family survive assassination plots, papal interdicts, and the shifting alliances of the Italian wars. The price of this dominance was an ever-present paranoia, a realization that the same ledgers that brought them glory also recorded the debts of men who would sooner see the Medici dead than pay what they owed, leading to a climate of surveillance and strategic marriages that bound the family to the decaying royalty of Europe. Cosimo's patronage of the arts, while celebrated as the catalyst for the greatest cultural flourishing in human history, was also a sophisticated form of soft power and propaganda, designed to justify the family's usurious wealth through the glorification of God and the beautification of the city, effectively laundering their reputation through the genius of Donatello, Brunelleschi, and Fra Angelico. Every fresco commissioned and every chapel built served as a visual testament to their legitimacy, a divine endorsement of their earthly accumulation. Yet the wheat of this legacy began to fracture the family's moral core as they moved further away from the merchant pragmatism of Giovanni and toward the aristocratic pretensions that would eventually lead to their undoing. The bank, once a robust engine of international trade with branches in London, Bruges, and Geneva, began to suffer from the neglect of heirs more interested in Neoplatonic philosophy and courtly intrigue than the grueling details of balance sheets and currency fluctuations. As the mid-15th century waned, the cracks in the Medici monolith began to widen, hidden behind the shimmering veil of the magnificent era of Lorenzo de Medici, whose charisma and poetic soul captivated the world, but whose fiscal mismanagement pushed the bank toward the precipice of ruin. Lorenzo, the grandson of Cosimo, inherited a city that worshipped him as a prince in all but name.
Yet he also inherited a target on his back that had grown too large to ignore, as the Pazzi family, backed by the Pope and the Archbishop of Pisa, began to weave a web of violence that would explode in the heart of the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore. This was the dark reality of the Medici ascent. For every masterpiece they inspired, they sowed a seed of resentment. For every diplomatic triumph, they incurred a debt of blood that would have to be settled in the narrow streets of Florence, where the line between a banker's ambition and a tyrant's cruelty became increasingly blurred. The Pazzi Conspiracy, erupting on April 26, 1478, was not merely a localized coup attempt, but a violent systemic rejection of the Medici's financial and religious hegemony. As the daggers struck Giuliano de Medici during the High Mass at Santa Maria del Fiore, his blood staining the cold marble of the Duomo, the era of rule by silent consensus came to a shattering end. Lorenzo de Medici, having narrowly escaped with a wound to his neck, responded with a retaliatory purge so swift and savage that it sent tremors through the courts of Europe. The sight of archbishops and conspirators hanging from the windows of the Palazzo Vecchio served as a grim visual manifesto that the price of challenging this unofficial dynasty was total annihilation. Yet behind this display of absolute strength was a widening fiscal abyss, as Pope Sixtus IV, the silent architect of the plot, froze all Medici assets in Rome and revoked their lucrative monopoly on the alum mines of Tolfa, a primary source of the liquidity that sustained Florentine splendor. Lorenzo the Magnificent found himself trapped in a paradox. While he was a master of diplomatic equilibrium and a visionary patron of Botticelli and Michelangelo, he was an indifferent banker who allowed the family's international branches in London and Bruges to wither through neglect and unsecured loans to war-hungry monarchs. The hidden cost of this political survival was the erosion of the bank's capital reserves, as Lorenzo increasingly blurred the line between his personal fortune and the public treasury of the Florentine Republic to fund his lavish displays of power and his desperate wars of defense. This financial desperation led to a dark moral compromise, where the Medici, once the pioneers of modern accounting, began to manipulate the communal funds of the Monte delle Doti, the dowry fund for Florentine daughters, effectively stealing the futures of the city's young women to pay for the mercenaries guarding the Medici gates. As the 1480s progressed, the atmosphere in Florence grew heavy with a simmering resentment, fueled by the fiery sermons of the Dominican friar Girolamo Savonarola, who depicted the Medici not as enlightened leaders, but as decadent usurers whose obsession with pagan antiquity and worldly wealth invited the wrath of God. The physical decay of the bank's ledgers mirrored the spiritual fracture of the city, creating a vacuum that the religious zealot Savonarola was all too eager to fill with visions of a bonfire of the vanities. When Lorenzo died in 1492, he left behind a legacy that was architecturally magnificent but structurally hollow, passing the mantle to his eldest son, Peter the Unfortunate, whose arrogance and lack of political instinct would lead to the family's humiliating expulsion from Florence in 1494. The great Medici palace was looted, its treasures scattered, and the bank that had once held the papacy in its debt was declared insolvent, marking the end of the Medici as merchant princes and the beginning of their transformation into a more traditional and perhaps more dangerous aristocratic force. This transition was marked by a shift in strategy. If they could no longer rule through the ledgers of a bank, they would rule through the mitres of the church, leading to the elevations of Giovanni de Medici as Pope Leo X, and later Giulio de Medici as Pope Clement VII. However, this ecclesiastical power came with its own dark consequences, as the heavy-handed sale of indulgences to fund the construction of St. Peter's Basilica, partially to pay off old Medici debts, became the catalyst for the Protestant Reformation, forever shattering the unity of Christendom. The family's eventual return to Florence as dukes, backed by the imperial might of Charles V, transformed the city from a vibrant republic into a guarded principality, where the Medici's hidden price was the loss of the very intellectual and civic freedom that had made the Renaissance possible. The establishment of the Grand Duchy under Cosimo I saw the construction of the Uffizi not as a gallery for the public, but as a labyrinth of administrative offices designed to centralize control and surveil a population that had once been the Medici's equals. The transition from gold to blood, from banking to hereditary titles, solidified their status, but at the cost of a permanent state of paranoia, where the fortress of the Belvedere looked down upon the city not as a protector, but as a jailer. The legacy of the Medici thus remains a complex tapestry of high art and low morality, a testament to the fact that the most enduring monuments of human history are often built upon a foundation of calculated betrayal and the ruthless exploitation of power. The transformation of the Medici from a family of private citizens into a hereditary dynasty of Grand Dukes brought with it a shift in the nature of their secrecy, moving from the discreet entries of a bank ledger to the labyrinthine corridors of the Vasari corridor. This elevated walkway, stretching from the Palazzo Vecchio to the Pitti Palace, allowed the Medici to move above the heads of the Florentine people, never touching the ground, a physical manifestation of their total detachment from the republic they had once claimed to serve. Under the reign of Cosimo I, the bank was no longer the heartbeat of the family. Instead, it was replaced by a sophisticated military bureaucratic machine that used the first modern secret service in Europe to maintain order through fear and assassination. The dark side of this new stability was a suffocating intellectual atmosphere, where the once vibrant spirit of Neoplatonic inquiry was replaced by the rigid orthodoxy of the Counter-Reformation, as the Medici sought to align themselves with the Inquisition to secure their tenuous titles from the Pope. The price of this absolute power was a series of internal tragedies that seemed to haunt the family like a curse, fueling rumors that the Medici had traded their souls for a crown. The sudden, mysterious deaths of Cosimo's children and his wife, Eleonora of Toledo, led to whispers of fratricide and poisoning behind the closed doors of the villa at Poggio a Caiano, suggesting that the ruthlessness once reserved for political rivals had now turned inward. This era saw the Medici transition from being the nurses of genius to becoming the patrons of a stifling courtly